what is the most impact of individual psychology we have? It's usually leaders of countries or leaders of major organizations and so on. And one of the things you mentioned with benign narcissism, that seems to be aligned with success, right? If you care about your own success, that's going to be, you're more likely to have narcissistic tendencies, I suppose. And so my question is, when you follow that thread of narcissism to become the leader of a country, now you have a lot of new, interesting psychological complexities to deal with, like power. That old cliche that power corrupts. Is it possible for power to corrupt the human mind to where it pushes you farther and farther into malignant narcissism, into this destructive envy? What are your thoughts on power, like the effect of power in the human mind?
Yeah. I think power is an accentuator, right? An intensifier, right? So I think it is true that there are people who can be sort of in a gray area where there are malignant narcissistic tendencies and behaviors, but there are also ways in which that person can think outside of themselves and think in a broader way and think sort of kindly about others. And they're sort of trying to navigate, whether they're aware or not, that they're trying to navigate between one and the other. And then the allure of power is, well, just exercise that power and you'll feel better, right? It'll show you, right, that you're good enough. Look at the power you have, and whatever may be going on in the person's mind, that then power, yes, can corrupt. Yes. And I think that's why we have to have checks and balances, right? Because we don't, we are all inscrutable to ourselves, let alone to others. So we must have checks and balances, and we should always have them on ourselves as well as on others. We should want that for the health of ourselves and the world around us. So I think all of that is true, but there are also people who don't necessarily become corrupted by power, right? That there can be an understanding and a grounding that they're a steward of power, right? A shepherd. I mean, the ways people describe utilizing power and utilizing it in a benign way that then fosters the healthy aspects of self, right? So like gratitude and humility, right? If we could add a healthy dose of gratitude and humility to everyone or to our society, there would be a sea change, right? But how do you feel gratitude? How do you feel humility? Those things are incompatible with narcissism, envy, right? With the bad pole of things that we're talking about. And part of the reason I'm so focused in my work and in really what runs through all of my thoughts about life is that the impact of trauma, right? Because trauma, creates these false lessons and it walls us off from truth, and it starts to point towards the unhealthy ways of trying to feel better about ourselves. But we have the health in us too. We have those seeds of health too that can grow into being a steward of power and sharing power and being considerate and kind. And we see a lot of that in the world too, right? It's not all just the evil. We see plenty of people who do good and who are generous of spirit. And, we have both in us. And it is I think you're talking about our culture and what the seeds that we sow and the climate that we set, including putting governors and boundaries around, like, how do we rein in or say that the more aggressive, the more envious or destructive is unacceptable, right? How do we foster the part that's kind and considerate and reflective and slow to judge, of like, hey, let's learn a little bit more. Like, how do we foster that? And I think a lot of that comes back to early childhood education. I mean, I think we don't do nearly enough to protect children. And as a corollary to that, we don't do nearly enough to educate children. I mean, I want to write a book. Second book I write is gonna be everything I needed to know about life I learned as a second year postgraduate psychiatry resident.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, why? Why then did I learn so much about unconscious motivation, about the impact of trauma, about how we can be envious and how we can act out, even about how our emotions trump logic in us. Like, why don't we teach these things when we're young enough to understand, like, why is that other kid bullying me?
Yeah.
Right? Or why, just because I'm a little bit bigger, do I want to go thump that other kid on the head? Like, what's going on? That we don't do those things. We're tripping ahead of ourselves, and we don't stop and think, how are we using our resources? How are we how are we shepherding forward the next generation, which, by the way, is a generation that's going to determine our fates too, right, as we get older. But we don't, do that. I often think of, like, in the Olympics, you see like the great sprinters, right? And they've got to come out of the blocks perfectly, right? So if they come out of the blocks a little bit too fast, they're going to fall over, right? They're going to just fall forward. And I often see that in my head about us as, as humans and as a culture, that we're rushing so far forward. We don't stop and say, wait, let's keep the basics here, the basic techniques of, like, how are we navigating forward in life? Or do we just throw all those away because I can get some benefit by saying that you're bad, even though what's being leveled against you is wrong, right? Like, why do I take that? Or do I say, no, there's something more important here that we want to shepherd forward in ourselves as a culture? And I think preventing childhood trauma and changing the ways that we educate children and adults could again make a sea change and maybe set us on a course towards, even towards a greater likelihood of survival as a species.
Yeah, so talking to, like, people in elementary school about human nature and teaching them how people can be resentful and envious, and how to deal with your emotions, how to so these basic interaction things about human relationships, about friendships, about betrayal, about love, about all those things. Like, it's actually strange that we kind of hope the parents talk about that kind of stuff,
Right.
but then the parents often need therapy themselves.
The parents that didn't learn it, right?
Yeah,
I
the
mean,
parents didn't learn
I'm
it,
not
right?
joking that I was mad. Second year after medical school, like, how is it? Like, I think of even things in my own life, and how like, how much shame I felt after my brother's suicide. Like, I was already an adult, right? I was a young adult, but I felt so much shame. I didn't, like, I had no understanding that like, it's a reflex to trauma, right? To feel guilt and shame, and that of course I was feeling that. It didn't mean it was true because I felt it, but I mapped the fact that I felt ashamed to the fact that I should have felt guilty and ashamed. And it like led to some very negative things in my life that I had to sort of pull myself back from and recover from. And, like, I didn't know that, right? I didn't know the automaticity of the reflex and how pervasive it can be and how it can put blinders on us. And I mean, it's just one example, but it's an example of something big that happens to people that we don't learn about. And I find myself sometimes having conversations with a person. So, I still do a lot of clinical care, of having conversations with a person after a tragedy. And I'm saying, I can't believe, right? Again, I'm saying the things that this person didn't learn in elementary school, because, like, none of us did, right? And then look at the misery and the suffering. And then I think this is one person among how many millions among us who try and go about their way without knowing things that are easily knowable, because they don't even know that they're knowable because we don't teach them to ourselves.